most founders initially kind of think, okay, if I build a great product, they will come, right? All I have to do is convince the buyer, the person that makes the technical decision anyways, for that particular product or service. All I have to do is convince them to say yes, and we've got the sale. And, I think Luke and I have definitely experienced over the course of time, that's the first part of the step, right? After you go through that initial sales cycle, you get the technical win. How do you actually bring that to fruition all the way to purchase order and getting money in the bank and delivering that product and service to the client? So.
All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today, we are diving into the part of software sales that many startups only fully see when they begin scaling internationally. A layer in the system that many startups, many teams wish they had understood much early in the journey. We are talking about that layer, between yes, we love your product, you getting the technical yes, and money actually hitting the bank account. It is surprisingly the layer you almost never really hear about in accelerators, incubators, MBA programs, or even inside most sales organizations, and probably definitely not in your pipeline reports. Also, many C-level CEOs, CFOs, CROs, and the GTM teams, they obsess over the demo, the champion, the ROI slides, and they should, because sales is an integral part. But when your deals start crossing, borders, currencies, procurement systems, compliance frameworks, channel ecosystems, and cloud marketplaces, you realize very quickly that sales isn't the only hard part. There is a hidden layer. There's something missing. And that gap, that unseen layer, is the layer between, I want to say, the win and the revenue, is exactly what we are here to unpack today. And this conversation will absolutely be essential for anyone, especially startups who are trying to scale in 2026 and beyond. All right, so with that, let's bring in the people who have lived this at global scale. It is an absolute pleasure to introduce someone who has quite literally lived every chapter of hypergrowth, the wins, the war stories, the operational chaos, all of it really. Scott Campbell is not just any GTM leader. He has led revenue organizations at several high-growth enterprise software companies, including Docker, Puppet, Jive Software, Tripwire, helping them scale globally, reach major milestones, and in some cases successfully exit through acquisitions. Most recently at Docker, he led revenue organizations where revenue expanded by nearly 19-fold in just under 4 years. So if you ever wanted someone to tell you what actually happens inside the enterprise buying cycle, not the theory, I'm not talking about the pitch deck version, the actual story, he is that person. He is now an investor and a board advisor at Luasai, and honestly, having access to his brain probably require a license.
Well, thank you for that introduction. I appreciate it. Yeah, good for my ego, I guess. But very glad to be here and have this conversation with you, Luke.
Thank you. So, Scott, thank you for joining us today. And also joining us here today, none other than our own co-founder and CEO at Luasai, Luke Hasty. Luke brings a different dimension to the whole conversation because while most of us are analyzing what's happening right now, he's already living 2, 3, 4, 5 years ahead in the future. And that perspective is exactly why we are so excited to have him here today. Luke is one of those few people who has gone from being inside the GTM engine to actually re-architecturing the engine itself. He also has spent years in the trenches of enterprise sales, selling softwares, watching firsthand how deals break, how they stall, why they stall, and where companies most consistently underestimate the operational drag. And that experience is exactly what led him to build something the industry didn't even have a name for it. At Luasai, we call it the transaction layer. We will talk about that. Luke, he sees the convergence of channel, marketplaces, and procurement, digital procurement years ahead in the future. And Luasai is quite literally built on that thesis. And Luke, thank you for joining the conversation as well. Well, gentlemen, thank you for being here. And before we dive in, Luke, have I missed anything in setting the stage?
No, that's great. Thank you very much. Looking forward to the conversation and sharing my thoughts and getting Scott's perspective on a problem that we shared for a number of years. So yeah, thank you.
All right. So the first question, I think, Scott, I'll ask you. You have scaled some of the fastest growing software companies over the past 30 plus years. From your experience, what is the biggest misconception founders, GTM leaders, even the C-level, they have about selling to large enterprises?
Good question. So yeah, from my background, just to elaborate on that a little bit, is joining companies very early in their evolution, right? So usually I joined in the first 10 employees, 15 employees of these companies that I've worked with, and been fortunate enough to have them grow into, significantly sized organizations, multi-billion dollar valuations, those sorts of things. And, I think it really matters about the stage in terms of where the company is at and what type of leadership team they have within those organizations, what sorts of experience they have. But I think, largely speaking, one of the biggest challenges that organizations have is, and especially founders maybe, that have not had experience in building organizations in the past, and go-to-market organizations specifically, is that they feel like they need the magic rainmaker sales reps. They need the silver-tongued devils out there that are going to gain access to organizations, have leverage relationships they already have within large organizations, large enterprises, and be able to effectively sweet talk, their way into those organizations and make sales. And yes, that is obviously, you need to have very talented sales reps in order to be able to do that. The one of the many, I guess, overall strategic questions that most organizations should be asking is, how do we do that most effectively and how do we do that most efficiently? Not all customers should be treated the same. Right. And so I think the initial impression is, okay, I'm just going to hire a bunch of reps. I'm going to give them geographic territories and have them sell into all those companies in the same way. And that clearly is probably not the right way to go about it. Most organizations really at this stage, and I think most organizations today, are really looking for that efficiency. Most investors in those companies are looking for efficiency to how they go to market. So I think it's critical to initially think about, okay, what resources do I assign and allocate to sell into which types of organizations? How do I look at that geographically? And how do I look at, more specifically, how do customers buy this technology? You've got to really look at the buyer, look at the organization, and say, how do they like to facilitate those types of transactions? In many cases, of course, with Luke and Luasai, the emphasis here is going to be on how do you build out a channel organization? How do you leverage the channel to better penetrate those organizations and enable those efficient transactions within those large organizations, especially as you expand internationally? So going back to, sorry, it's a long-winded answer to your question, but the misconceptions, I think, are really about, a one-size-fits-all model initially, where organizations really, from a go-to-market standpoint and the sales part specifically, should be thinking about, how do I have a direct sales organization? How do I have a channel? How do I implement channel most effectively within those organizations and leverage those relationships that channel organizations have? And then thirdly, which is introduced, especially over the last 10 years, a whole other level of complexity, is how do I leverage the cloud marketplaces from AWS, Google Cloud, and Azure to effectively penetrate those organizations as well?
Fantastic. Happy to jump in here on my side as well. The biggest misconceptions, I'm not sure if it's necessarily a misconception, but an evolution of a company and the way that the process works when transacting with customers changes as the company gets bigger and does bigger deals and spreads internationally, like Scott says. I think most founders and most resources aimed at founders, especially if they're US-based originally or selling into their home geography to start with, is that it's a direct line relationship with the customer, that you have a product, you go speak to people that work at the business that you want to sell to, and then you convince them that your product is going to be something that they can work with or is going to solve a problem for them, or they identify things that it can help them with. and then you sell them the product and you go from there. The reality is that when you're selling to really big companies, not just on the end customer side, it's complex, but in between your company and the end customer, it's complex. Like Scott mentions, there are services providers that they work with for different elements of their business. There are different channels that they will purchase through depending on the budget allocation for that particular year. There are initiatives like supplier consolidation and rebate schemes, and there is an entire ecosystem in between manufacturers of software and big companies. These big companies have their own ecosystem around them all the time, and figuring out how to fit into that is not something that's really discussed, like you say, in the incubators and when you're at that very early stage of just trying to find product market fit, trying to build a product that really is something that people want to use and solves a real problem. Because the how to buy is a very different question to the why to buy.
Yeah, and to dovetail on that, I think most founders initially kind of think, okay, if I build a great product, they will come, right? All I have to do is convince the buyer, the person that makes the technical decision anyways, for that particular product or service. All I have to do is convince them to say yes, and we've got the sale. And, I think Luke and I have definitely experienced over the course of time, that's the first part of the step, right? After you go through that initial sales cycle, you get the technical win. How do you actually bring that to fruition all the way to purchase order and getting money in the bank and delivering that product and service to the client? So that, and Luke, you alluded to it, right, creates that's the beginning part of that whole buying cycle, which a lot of companies initially don't have expertise in how to handle it and manage it efficiently. So you get the technical win, then you've got to convince the stakeholders, the people with the budget, the financial aspects of the organization, make sure the budget is allocated appropriately. Then you need to go through security reviews. And then there's a whole paperwork process in terms of getting an enterprise license agreement in place. Almost every organization you sell to of any size, and it doesn't matter the size of, it could be a $10,000 sale or $1 million sale, you usually have to negotiate a end user license agreement. And that can take months to go through that entire process. It can take weeks to months to go through the security compliance checks that you need to get in order to effectively or get the authorization internally for the security team to allow the customer to actually install the software. So there's a whole set of complexity there that is effectively, and we'll get to it a little bit later in the conversation, I'm sure, but that can be helped and aided by the channel and Luasai in particular.
All right. We also hear more and more about channels, cloud marketplaces, and partner ecosystems. There seems to be a confusion. Is there a confusion? And what is actually happening in the market right now? Are startups actually getting all of this wrong?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in on this one. There is a lot of confusion. I think that ties back to the first question, really, which is misconceptions or just the first time that a lot of founders are embarking on the different phases of the go-to-market that you have as your company becomes bigger, more successful, your product becomes more mature. Cloud marketplaces entered the scene 5-ish years ago and have been revolutionary, really, for a lot of customers. It's added a massive new channel and opportunity for how customers can buy and also how ISVs and software manufacturers can sell. I think a lot of the confusion comes from lack of clarity on the different phases of a sales cycle and the different roles of each party within those phases. So cloud marketplaces can be both a fulfillment mechanism as well as a business generation mechanism. So you can sell with sellers at Amazon and Microsoft and Google, and they can assist you in engaging with an end customer and helping connect with projects that they're involved with. And that's very much a business generation motion. That is separate to the fulfillment and procurement mechanism that cloud marketplaces also provide, which is a way for procurement teams in large enterprises to leverage the big contract and financial commitments that they already have with that cloud provider. And those two things don't have to happen the same way in every deal. You don't need to leverage both of them all of the time. And some organizations that we see focus on one element of that. I think where you start to get confusion is that you mix up those two motions and you think just because you are involved in one part, then you're automatically going to get the other part. Most often that means if we are selling to our customers through the marketplace, then we can expect business to come from the marketplace just because we're engaged. They're separate motions, both are possible, but you need to really understand how your organization fits into the selling motion of Amazon or Microsoft in order to get the business generation capabilities. And just because your customers are purchasing through that route doesn't mean that the salespeople at those cloud providers are all of a sudden going to start bringing you leads. That is probably the biggest misconception that we see. And then the second element of that is, well, if I'm transacting this through the marketplace, why do I need the channel? Why do I need resellers? Why do I need partners at all? And we see some companies who decide very early on in their go-to-market that they're marketplace first. That means I don't need to pay channel margins or involve resellers in deals. And again, it's the same situation. When you look at the different phases of a sales cycle, or not even a sales cycle, including the post-sale part of a customer engagement, different partners play different roles. The transactional part, the fulfillment, contractual part that you may leverage a major reseller for at the moment to help a customer purchase a product may be replaced by cloud marketplace in a certain deal. The partners are also involved in marketing, selling, value proposition, POCs, and that's on the business generation side of things. But then also implementation and customer success, training on the product, and the confusion that you don't need partners to be involved because you can transact through the marketplace usually leads to a less developed customer success motion because partners bring more value than that to the table. So what we're already seeing really is that the market trend is that two motions are combined. The cloud providers from very early on realized that this was a motion that they needed to support. They've had things like CPPO and MPO and the different acronyms for how to include a partner on a marketplace transaction have been across all three cloud service providers for years, because they know most often the product that's being sold through the marketplace is going to need some sort of support and some sort of involvement from people that are not just the manufacturer. And Amazon, Microsoft, and Google, they don't see it as their job to go and make sure that a customer is successful with a third-party product. So it goes back to that enterprises have a whole ecosystem of people around them, helping them select, implement, integrate technologies. Just because the transaction flows through the marketplace doesn't mean that changes. You still need the experts, the technical experts, the architecture experts, the training teams, the customer success teams that a lot of these enterprises rely on external companies to provide outside of the manufacturer of the product itself. So we see the selling motions, the fulfillment motions, the technical integration motions being combined. The most successful ISVs that we see leverage the best of both channels. Definitely utilize the financial benefits of fulfillment via a cloud marketplace if that's what your customer wants to do. But the value of the channel around finding new opportunities and helping implement technology and supporting your customer, especially as you scale, becomes more and more important. You can take a shortcut, move everything through marketplace wholesale. We've seen several organizations who did that initially, but then had to retrofit partners into customer engagements that had been done through the marketplace because they had challenges in scaling customer success and expanding accounts and deploying the technology once it had been purchased. So for us, that's how we see things converging. I think the market is pretty on board with that too, with all the figures that you see about channel involvement in marketplace deals. That is confusion that we see usually when companies are still figuring out how they're going to go to market, is understanding the push and pull of sales and different roles of different parties in that transaction cycle.
Great. If you don't mind, I'll jump in as well. So tackle this two-part. So Well, three-part maybe. As Luke said, initially it seems like a brilliant idea, right? Go directly to marketplaces. I don't have to worry about maybe a direct sales team. I don't have to worry about channel, that kind of thing. It seems very simple on the outside. But let's say, for example, you're trying to sell into a mid-sized bank in Paris. Initially, the opportunity in many cases is brought to you by a reseller, right? Reseller identifies an opportunity. The customer has a need. The reseller identifies the perfect product to bring into that organization. The partner and maybe a direct sales rep from the company and sales engineering get involved in doing a proof of concept. They successfully bring that to a yes from the technical decision maker. Then it becomes back to what I said earlier, right? How do we actually acquire the product? And let's say, for example, they wanted to use the marketplace in order to do that. If your initial thought was, okay, I just sell through the marketplace and I can cut out and not have to leverage resellers or even direct sales reps in that process, you've lost, you're not going to be able to make that sale. Ultimately, you're going to create a lot of friction if that reseller cannot help your organization transact through the marketplace effectively. Let's say, for example, this mid-sized bank has a private pricing agreement already in place with AWS. So let's say, for example, the client has a private pricing agreement in place with AWS, and they want to use the marketplace in order to make that transaction. That becomes problematic in many situations, right? Again, if you're thinking that you just be able to use the marketplace to make that transaction and not have to involve third parties. Otherwise, in many cases, what we found is it created just a lot of confusion on the part of the sales organizations, the channel, and the customer in terms of how you actually again, get the product sold into the client effectively and solve their particular need. So it does seem like the easy button marketplaces, but it is a lot more complex than that. And if you don't think about it from a wholehearted or from a comprehensive standpoint in terms of how you facilitate or take into account the various different parties involved, you can create a lot of friction in that process and lose a lot of the value that marketplaces provide.
Yeah. Also, from our experience, if you can only normally cut a reseller out once or twice, and that's the last deal that they're going to be bringing you. So what we see, and like Scott says, having a comprehensive view of your go-to-market needs to be a long-term view. From our experience, from the CEO downwards, you need to have a longer-term view and get shorter and shorter down to sales reps that need to be quarterly focused, ultimately. Making the decision to leverage marketplaces in the short term to save 5%, 10%, the maybe margin that you would pay to a reseller isn't going to help you build a 9-figure company. You look at the advice that most VCs are giving their portfolio companies, it is you need a channel, you need an ecosystem, because the most successful software companies in the world, that's how they ended up the size that they were. Red Hat, VMware, Salesforce, Microsoft, Oracle, all of these organizations, they don't do all of this stuff on their own. Alienating the channel, moving them from deals, it's a short-term solution to save a little bit of money. In the end, and like I mentioned before, as you grow, and if you're able to keep successfully growing, it's going to be a little bit more expensive. You need more direct sales reps. You will eventually need to start leveraging third parties to help you with different parts of your business, because it's not possible to scale directly yourself anymore. So setting things up in competition, picking one channel over the other, you don't need to do it. It's possible to get everybody pulling in the same direction. And that's fundamentally the better long-term strategy anyway. Conflict between channels tends to end up with pain, which slows things down, which gets in the way of your ultimate goal, which is some sort of exit. So, yeah.
So if we were to strip away all the noise, simply put, where do deals actually break, and what is the exact moment everything starts slowing down?
I've always found it quite interesting that if you ask pretty much any software company in our space that we're working with, someone that's selling enterprise level infrastructure, cyber, data, software to big companies, how long is your sales cycle? 6 to 9 months. Industry standard, 6 to 9 months is an average sales cycle for a product in our space. Why the variability? What is the difference between 6 months and 9 months? Very often, most organizations as manufacturers, as ISVs, have got a pretty well-defined sales playbook, proof of concept, evaluation framework, whatever it is. They've got the resources dedicated to getting customers through the different steps of demo, followed by installation of the product so they can test it out, all the way through to, okay, let's fill out the ROI documentation that we need to justify why we buy that. Sometimes those phases can be what slows down. Customer doesn't have enough resource, or they're not able to allocate the people that they need to do it. Usually a sales rep is good at kind of qualifying things out at that phase if they're not getting the commitment that they need from the customer. Where we really see the variability in time tends to be after the technical team have decided they want to purchase the product, that they feel that the product is going to be the right thing for them to bring into the organization. At that time, they usually switch sides to be on the side of the sales reps, and the sales rep and the technical team at the organization are working together now to build the business case and to get the purchase through the process. This is pretty common almost every enterprise that we've worked with, and we've worked with hundreds across the years. And it's a difficult process, even for the people that work at the company. Usually you're selling and working with a technical person, like a chief architect or a platform manager or an engineering director or someone like that. Their job is building and running technology platforms and teams and cybersecurity deployments inside the organization. But now all of you are facing the same task, which is, how do I get this through procurement? How do I make the business case to my manager or the finance department or the legal team or whoever it is? This is an area, a phase of the sales cycle, which is much lesser developed from a best practices perspective. Lots of qualification frameworks and BANT, MEDIC, these sorts of things. And even those types of frameworks, you get to the procurement phase and it's sort of like hopefully we've built up enough momentum to get us over the line. What we feel is that there are definite tactics and organizations and people and ways to speed up this phase of the sales cycle, because this is where you really get the kind of hidden blockers or bureaucratic steps that really can slow things down. Legal team at a big enterprise organization, cross domain, they've got every problem to deal with, and you are one of the problems in the queue, whereas your technical stakeholder, this is obviously a major priority for them. They've been able to allocate the resource, they've been able to get the first 2/3 of the sales cycle done because they want it to happen. Procurement, finance, legal, inside an enterprise, you're competing for their attention. So where things can slow down is, how do you map to the stakeholders in those departments, and how do you have the relationships to leverage in those departments to be able to move the purchase through these different silos. And this is where, for us, we leverage pre-existing relationships, pre-existing ecosystem, because there are partners who are working with those different departments every day on multiple purchases, who have done deals over the years with these organizations and the people in those different departments who really know how it works. Maybe more so than the stakeholder that you're working with as a software company. Chief architect probably hasn't done as many deals as the account manager for the procurement provider that the organizations work with for 5 years. So there are different elements, like Scott's mentioned before, license agreements, how you purchase, which currency you purchase in, which law governs the agreement, just things like setting up transactional relationships to be able to purchase through the bank accounts has to go through a dedicated process inside an organization. If you're a new supplier, you need to be checked as an organization, going through compliance and legal checks, financial checks. Is starting from scratch. And be a massive efficiency is leveraging an existing route, because they've gone through those checks before, got relationships with the people that you need to deal with. Fundamentally, allowing a level of local translation of currency, translation of language, translation of law, because this is a bigger problem, especially internationally. If you're a US company trying to do a deal with a public sector organization in Germany, you don't even know the compliance regulations that you need to meet. So you need to be educated by the end customer on what they are, and you need to respond to them. This is where delays can really happen. So working with somebody who understands them already, working for somebody who is, as a business, able to take on a level of risk on your behalf or be the intermediary from a legal or financial perspective, really, really can trim months off a sales cycle. And if you're a fast growing Series A, Series B company, that time is what it's all about. So That's where we see the delays. That's where we see the benefit of leveraging local relationships or the pre-existing ecosystems. Our goal is to connect vendors to that ecosystem because we've been doing deals for years this way. But 6 to 9 months should be 6 months. It need not be that extra 3 months. And that's a massive drag on an organization who's growing at 3, 4, 500% a year.
Jump in here. Totally agree. Going back to that example of a 9-month sales cycle, I think by leveraging the channel, you can shave 3 months off that total process. Getting to be an authorized vendor for larger enterprises around the globe, especially internationally, can be an incredibly frustrating, time-consuming process. Tons of paperwork, security reviews, legal contracts, vendor onboarding forms that, 12 pages long. It can be extremely frustrating. And if you can leverage a reseller that already has a lot of those agreements in place, you can shave months off the sales cycle. And I'd say as a sales leader in the past, getting to the technical champion has made the decision to go with your product and convince their boss to allocate the appropriate budget to acquire the product. That was a straightforward process, right? You could control that process. What you can't control is that second part of that process of how does the customer actually acquire the product? And that's where the channel, again, can be incredibly helpful. And again, at Docker and other organizations that I've worked with where we leverage the channel effectively, it's drastically reduced the sales cycle and provided a huge amount of value.
I think it's worth actually chiming in on why not all software companies do this automatically, right? If it was this easy, like why do they not do it? A lot of these resellers or system integrators or partners that you can leverage in the channel for access to these enterprises are themselves publicly listed companies. So whilst they may exist to streamline this process, and fundamentally they're built around the customer and helping their customer and providing this service to their customer is something that they're happy to do. But engaging with them on their own is still potentially fairly time consuming, right? And that's fundamentally why we exist, is to try and eliminate the fact that, all right, you've gone from not having to deal with 1,000 enterprises directly, but now you need to deal with 200 major resellers directly. It's still a huge burden, and if you don't know who the reseller is, or you've never done a deal in that country before, or you don't have the facility to be able to take payment in the currency that reseller operates in, you still have a lot of challenges. Until now, the way to engage with that channel has itself been quite painful and slow, which is why a lot of organizations on balance will say, do I want to pay 10% a deal to make this go a little bit faster? Maybe. Or am I just going to bite the bullet, save a little bit of the money and do this direct? Because we know that we're at least directly involved and in control. So it's not entirely on lack of knowledge about this route to market that organizations don't engage with it. It's just that until now, the way to do it has been painful in itself, which is really why we're trying to solve that problem. Is startup companies should be able to engage with these organizations without major enterprise requirements, friction, delays. That's our main goal.
Yeah, and I've certainly seen that in the past. I think many of the organizations that I've been with, for example, have attempted to leverage the channel, build a channel organization internally with channel managers that go out and try to engage the appropriate distributors and resellers. There are a couple of different ways to go at it. You can sign up resellers directly, right? Again, if you are trying to expand internationally, especially, and tackle Asia, Europe, Latin America all at the same time, that's hundreds of different resellers you'd have to sign up and hundreds of different contracts that you'd have to try to negotiate with those resellers in order to do that effectively. So the next step, of course, is most organizations say, okay, well, we should sign on with one of the bigger distributors that already has those relationships. And yes, they're huge organizations, like Luke said, publicly traded organizations that sell hundreds of millions and billions of dollars of hardware and software around the globe. There's the rub, right? As a startup, maybe you've got 50, 100 million, $200 million in revenue, and maybe 30, 40% of that is going through the channel. If that's the case, you're a rounding error for those organizations. They don't care. Their sales reps are compensated just like any sales rep. They've got quotas to meet, and they're going to typically go after and really focus on those vendors that are going to get them to their quotas the quickest. And so those are going to be vendors that are already well established with high average order sizes, those sorts of things. And oftentimes Series B, C, D companies that, again, in that $50 to $200 million range, just don't have the order size or the total amount of revenue to gain the attention of the distributors effectively. So that's really where Luasai comes into play, right? Smaller organization can dedicate resources to those startups, to making sure that SVs that are getting off the ground, expanding their footprint around the globe, they can dedicate the time and attention to those organizations very effectively.
I think everything that we just discussed sort of naturally brings us to the solution. As I mentioned before, we at Luasai, we refer to that as the transaction layer. So Luke, maybe I'll come to you first on this one. How would you define this transaction layer or the GTM infrastructure that we are building at Luasai? Also, if you are advising Series A to C startups today, what is one capability they absolutely need to build or partner for if they want to scale globally without burning endless time and headcount?
Yeah. The second part of the question first, what do they need? They need to be able to transact in any way that their customers wish to transact. You really do not want to be in a situation where a customer asks to purchase through a certain route and you have to tell them, we can't support that. You're trying to do everything at this point to show them that you are a serious professional organization and that you are ready and suited to working with them as a business. So being able to handle any transaction route that the customer wishes to go down, number one, that's something that we would suggest. By being able to do that, usually the customer is going to request whatever is the most efficient route for them. So it's in your benefit to be able to sell via the local partner that they work with or the cloud marketplace that they have a relationship with. It's going to speed things up. They won't suggest it's going to save them money, which is another reason you look like a good partner to them. So being able to interact with the ecosystems that live around these enterprises, that for us is the problem that we aim to solve. And the transaction layer and go-to-market infrastructure that we believe should exist is, like Scott mentions, you've got distribution companies who have got legal arrangements with many thousand resellers. What we want to provide is a transaction layer which is the same, the legal and financial relationship, contractual relationship to be able to transact and interact with these channel organizations around the world at the speed of software. Being able to interact through a software-like experience to transact across resellers so that whichever enterprise in whichever country it is that you want to do a deal with, you have got the transaction layer, the product infrastructure, send a quote, receive an invoice, send a license through the required channels that are pre-approved, pre-built, and proven. Allows people to have ops teams to not worry about getting new reseller agreements signed up, handling different currencies, handling different law, handling things like collections from different countries all around the world. We've aimed to build the transaction infrastructure which allows you to connect into that existing ecosystem in a pre-built way. Identifying, you've got your customer, identifying the efficient route, quotations, money flow, all of it's pre-built. You can plug in, connect, and then operate. That a Series B, Series C, Series D company needs, not a system which is designed for Microsoft, IBM, these kind of organizations. That's really what the structure is right now. So what we deliver, we have relationships with 10,000 resellers around the world, which maps out to tens of thousands of enterprises. We've done transactions in 80 countries in the last 12 months. You're a startup, you don't need to go and build a channel from scratch. Plug into our pre-existing network and transact through our platform.
And Scott, now that you have also joined Luasai as a board advisor and an investor, would you like to add to that, about the transaction layer that we are building, the importance that you see in the existence of this category?
Not much to add. I think Luke and the team are really onto something here. I think one of the challenges working through distribution, well, the companies I've had in the past, is visibility and transparency in terms of, lack of a better way to say it, who's got the ball, right? So when you work through distribution, it can get, again, opaque in terms of, where the deal actually is in the process. We've issued a quote to distribution, the distributor has issued the quote to the resellers issued the quote to the customer, and where it is in that process, revisions to quotations, which inevitably happens through that process, and then changes in terms of quantity or discount or what have you. Ensure that it's clear in terms of as the sales rep at the ISV itself, who do I contact? How do I appropriately forecast this opportunity? And when is it going to close, and creating transparency to that entire process, in addition to the other benefits that it has, is incredibly beneficial with the confidence and, again, predictability around the business that I think is paramount.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about where all of this is heading. Now that we have unpacked what actually stores a deal, the timelines, the friction points, even a solution, I want to shift our focus towards the future for a little bit. Luke, I think I'll come to you first on this one as well. What does enterprise buying look like over the next 3 to 5 years? And how do things like AI, marketplaces, and the evolution of procurement start to sort of like change the game? And Scott, I would love for you to also jump in here with your perspective.
Yeah, it's the pace of things in the last year has accelerated once again. We've seen shifts like this in the past. The shifts get bigger, but the move from hardware to virtual machines, and then from virtual machines to cloud and containers, and every shift like that expanded the ecosystem. Beginning, you had a few hardware providers, most of them still exist. Then you had an ecosystem that exploded around virtual operating systems and that sort of thing. Then cloud and cloud native ecosystem, and the landscape of number of manufacturers is now bigger than it's ever been. I think going forward, with the abilities that AI tooling gives you to build products and improve products, and the speed at which you can develop products, is going to mean more product companies really solving different problems. AI itself is going to be solving pre-existing problems, but there will be new opportunities and new problems that come about. Fundamentally, the same situation has always been true, which is if you are a bank and you have a certain amount of time or resources that you can dedicate, where are you going to put them? You can now use AI to build tooling that maybe you purchased in the past. You could have hired more engineers in the past to build that tooling too. Most enterprises will use these new capabilities and the resources that they have to become a better version of what they already deliver for their customers, rather than necessarily rebuild all of their infrastructure. So I think that we're going to see more and more tooling aimed at helping companies go faster and faster in delivering their own services to their customers in a more software native way. The digital transformation trend continues, and really what that means for us and the world that we live in, and what does that mean if you're an ISV, is that the barrier to entry used to be building the product, getting a team of developers, getting a couple million in funding to be able to build an MVP product market fit. Very difficult. You needed to have the history. This is why we have a lot of technical founders of companies, because they can go and convince the people with the cash at the VC layer to invest in them, because they understand how to build a product that solves the problem. We're looking at a future where, as long as you understand the problem, you can build a product. And that's going to mean a lot more products. So I think really it shifts the barrier to entry, or the bottleneck, further down the pipeline. All of a sudden now it's who's got market share or mind share in the market, the marketing, sales process, the sales cycle, and fundamentally how you sell is going to become more and more of a differentiator. If you are able to get your product at the top of the list in an enterprise, whether that is an AI tool picks it itself over your competition, or whether you are able to the ear of the person who is making a decision on the new platform rollout really becomes more and more imperative. So tapping into the people who are helping these enterprises make these decisions is more important than ever. For us, we see complexity going up, and with complexity going up, increases the need for abstraction and aggregation, which is what we aim to provide. So we think there'll be more tools, there'll be more deals, there'll be more IT spend, there'll be more partners being created to go and solve new innovative problems. For us, it really just increases the importance of that abstraction layer, that connective tissue to be able to transact within that ecosystem.
Add on that a little bit. I think Luke's got a lot more deep thoughts on this than I do, especially since I haven't been in the game for the last couple of years. But the things that I have learned, and speaking to former colleagues and other folks within ISVs that I've worked for in the past, is that the pace of change with agentic AI in general, tools that are being deployed in the enterprise, is dramatic. And as Luke suggested, the complexity, just because AI is, makes a lot of tasks easier, it's actually incredibly complex to deploy a lot of these tools within the enterprise itself. And that's really where value-added resellers are going to come into play, right? So I think the channel in many respects is going to be more, channel and channel partners are going to be more relevant going forward than they maybe have in the past, even more so in the sense that because of that complexity, because a lot of organizations are quite sure, they know they need to do AI and work on AI projects. They're not sure how to actually deploy those products internally. So they're going to have to engage with those local organizations that can help provide the services on the ground, effectively integrate those solutions and take advantage of the capabilities that they offer. So that's, again, it only increases the value that partners offer.
Yeah. Something that we've heard a lot about from AWS and other people in the market is the role of agents in procurement. Mm-hmm. We've seen from organizations like Harvey and others, which are domain specific, that I can hopefully play a role in legal processes and contract reviews and all of the admin that we talked about earlier can take a lot of time in the sales cycle of enterprise organizations. The reason that they work with external companies is a risk element. It is, we offset some of our risk. How do we move some of the collections issues or financial burden onto organizations that are not ourselves? Hopefully going forward, we see still this blend of both. We're going to see the burdensome toil of contract reviews, EULA negotiations start to speed up because of the role of AI. But at the same time, do we think regulation and the way that these organizations have chosen to structure their risk by moving their EULA negotiation to a third-party reseller who aggregates a lot of the risk for them, it's not going to really change very soon, I don't think. I think enterprises and certainly if you're dealing with public sector entities or the way that purchasing needs to happen, there is a lot of regulation around corruption, anti-bribery, the way that things are purchased, getting fair pricing isn't going to change, but still hopefully within that process it does start to go faster because of the role of AI and procurement agents. Do believe so, but companies in the world, Scott says they're looking at AI, they're figuring out how to use it. Is that going to change the bureaucracy internally rapidly? I don't think it is. So we're going to see this strange hybrid world where they need to purchase more products and that the individual cycles can maybe go faster. We just talked about the role of the intermediary could be even higher because the risk that they have in all of that purchasing has gone up. Yeah, interesting to see.
All right. Thanks, gentlemen. I think we are reaching the final parts of the interview. This one probably I want to take up with Scott first, because you do have 30 plus years of experience being a CRO and a revenue leader. If you could give one piece of advice to every founder or CROs watching this, with all that we just discussed, what would that be, Scott?
Maybe going back to the earlier part of the conversation is so the main focus most organizations have is getting product market fit. How do we build the best mousetrap, and or the newest mousetrap, and how do we convince buyers to buy that? So what I've seen time and time again at startups is So the management team is hyper focused on that and not planning for success. In other words, making sure that once they built that fantastic mousetrap, how do we optimize the way in which it's acquired? How do we smooth that process to get this into customers' hands? Because they don't take into account that bureaucratic process of enterprises and how they actually acquire products. And so to think about it holistically, is that involves direct sales reps, sales engineering, back-end office operations, credit checks, legal, currency conversion, nuances and details that they need to handle, managing international offices and how you effectively do that, on the right personnel and those sorts of things. And most importantly, of course, and most relevant to this conversation is how do you effectively leverage the channel and distribution in particular to go to market most efficiently. I think if most founders would have spent more time on that early on in the process, then accelerating revenue and making revenue more predictable and creating a lot less friction in the process would have been incredibly helpful to the organization, right? They would achieve their goals and aspirations faster. And that's what everybody's looking for today. The advent of AI, some of the pressures on the tech industry in particular, financing angle, all investors, all founders, or all board members at this point are really going to be focused on how do we create the most efficient organization as possible? How do we avoid having to just throw bodies at a problem? Let's think of ways in which we can leverage tactics, other strategies in order to avoid just adding personnel, because personnel is just so expensive. By leveraging the channel effectively, what you're at the end of the day, what you're doing is you're paying as you go, right? So yes, one of the biggest impediments or arguments against using the channel is the fact that you have to pay a margin, right? What I'd encourage most organizations to do is think about that in the sense that you're only paying margin for success. You have to go out there and invest millions of dollars in building out a direct sales organization, perhaps internationally, leverage the channel effectively internationally, but domestically as well. Then you're paying to play, right? And as their success grows, as they're able to penetrate more and more organizations, bring more revenue into your organization, you're just paying for that success rather than making a huge upfront investment. So hopefully that helps.
Ultimately, I agree with Scott. I think most organizations that we partner with when they're early don't know if they're going to get to $100 million in revenue. They don't know if they're going to get to $500 million in revenue. So it's hard for them to plan accordingly. Certainly in the world that we live in the routes to market and channel and that sort of stuff, is plan for success, those strategic decisions long term, because it's very hard to retrofit them when you're in the middle. Going back, adding in a layer which reduces ARR of existing customers as an example, you may need a partner to help with customer success. Doesn't look great on the balance sheet. So I would suggest to a founder is think long-term, think strategically about your different routes to market and structure things so that they're all pulling in the same direction and that they're not in conflict with each other. If you want to do channel, great. If you want to do marketplaces, great. Don't comp different teams differently on those two routes to market. You want to make sure that you understand the value that each party brings to the different stage of the sales cycle and then line them all up so that they're all working together.
All right. Scott, Luke, thank you so much for the clarity and the insights that you have brought to this conversation. And thank you everyone for watching as well. If you are a CEO, a CFO, CRO, a GTM leader trying to scale globally, I really do hope that this gave a clearer lens into what's actually happening beneath the surface. If you have any questions or thoughts, feel free to drop them in the comment section or try and connect with the rest of the Luasai team. We will link everything in the description below. And also, we will be doing more conversations like this more often. So do stay tuned to our channels. And I guess thanks again. And we'll see you in the next one.